Can you see a role for an independent agency at the federal level, and Commonwealth EPA, for instance, that would have a role in, if not actually making decisions, providing independent advice to the Minister of the day, to exercising oversight over the sort of system of bilateral assessment agreements, for instance, and RFAs and so forth?
The very short answer is potentially yes. That's one of the that's probably top of the list, the things that we're talking to people about, or particularly I'm talking to people about. Alan obviously dealt with that quite a bit in his review, particularly interested in option C in his review, if you go back to that, which I think is more modelled on the old WA model, rather than decision making, sort of an arm's length assessment and advice process to the Minister. I'm open for a discussion about more radical alternatives than that, like an EPA, national EPA body. I'm deliberately bringing an open mind to that. I don't have a strong view, although the last, I think, of Larissa's comments about the way in which the Minister balances the environmental, economic and social impacts of a particular project were very apparent to me in my long time as the Environment Minister, because it is a shock to someone after you come back from Yarralumla with your certificate from the Governor-General that one of the major roles for you as the Environment Minister is to consider mining developments. And so I think there are very significant issues for me about the process from the start up until at the moment the Minister ticks off or otherwise on a project approval, and I'm very open to that discussion. Before my long time in the environment portfolio, I was mainly a social policy minister in mental health and ageing and housing and homelessness. And in that area, one of the things we grappled with quite a bit is the governance approach to policy making and regulation. And the idea, particularly that we canvassed with the Productivity Commission in some social policy context, of the merit of separating policy making and in quite a structural sense, separating policy making and regulation or implementation of policy. And that for me was a very important process of thinking through in the context of aged care reform, but I think it's generally a good lesson across government about how agencies and ministers operate. So again, back to the short answer, I'm quite open to a good discussion about that. I'm taken by Alan's review, but a lot of organisations are starting to send me ideas already about alternative methods of assessment, advice, and ultimate approval. So yes.
I might just ask Andrew if you wishes to comment on this.
I was going to add actually that a lot of business would actually welcome that kind of view. If you look at the behaviour, particularly in New South Wales over the last few years, and to a lesser extent what's been going on in Queensland, business putting a lot of money into major projects does not want the uncertainty of it being taken away, so that the efficacy and the governance of the approvals process is in fact, I think, much more critical than the cost of actually obtaining the approvals process. Largely because that efficacy and that financial investment has already been, to a large extent, signed off by a board some many months beforehand, if not some years beforehand. And so the last thing that they could afford to have is for a process which would be corrupted, and I say that deliberate, corrupted by whatever is the unfortunate outcome, so that it's distance from the policy making as opposed to its administrative decision process making, I think is laudable. And that, from an international perspective, is something that we're starting to see as well. So I certainly would welcome it.
The EPBC Act, by its nature, is a reactive instrument. It reacts to proposals from essentially industry. I think the achievements of the NEPM system have been modest, to say the least, but I think its potential is significant. And in the climate space, we are thinking, as I'm sure Larissa is, I'm not so sure Greg is, thinking about a range of measures other than the idea of a cap and trade system to start to drive a cleaner energy system, and one obvious is vehicle emission standards, for example. So there is the capacity, I think, for that sort of a framework in a proactive sense rather than reactive framework in the EPBC Act to start to drive change. Now, whether it's actually that the council and all those sorts of things that go with the current framework, I'm not sure, but I'm very interested in the idea of a mechanism by which the Commonwealth can drive proactive change in areas like vehicle emission standards and things like that, which now see Australia really won out. And we know that the global car companies sell significantly dirtier versions of the global brands here in Australia than they do in North America and Europe, because we don't have those sorts of standards. So again, in the hierarchy of political and policy focus, you've sort of got climate up the top at the moment, then you've got EPBC, and I think NEPM is way down there, Rob, so I encourage you to continue to advocate it.
The point that was made by both Mark and Larissa around we can't afford 8 states and 2 territories, sorry, not quite 8 states, but you know what I mean. States and territories, and the old notion of how many railway gauges are you going to end up with, is something that business absolutely abhors in this country. Absolutely abhors. If they hate so-called duplication and green tape, they hate more trying to, and they've given up, forum shopping in relation to the best state to deliver what they want. They go where the customer is, they go where the resource is, they go where the capital lies. And then the notion then of the operation of something like standards around air quality, soils, are absolutely critical from a national perspective. Why? Because international capital looks at that. It doesn't look at state-based regulation and what it may mean and then make a decision about putting out a massive financial outlay. It wants to understand that there is a blanket approach that they can take wherever they want to invest.
Samantha, did you want to add to that?
I guess just picking up on the business certainty angle, I think that, and sort of tying that into what we're talking about is quality information and sort of quality decision making, I think. Business certainty, as you were saying before, it would come from, I guess, knowing early on, before the boards have made these decisions and these investments have been made early on. And I guess that means that you need to have access to really good information, and we just don't until the assessments are already going on and finding the information about whether that may be critical habitat or threatened species habitat. At that point, usually isn't going to stop it. So wouldn't it be better to know early on for business? Also, I think business certainty derives a lot from the social licence that it has. So, you know, we basically have the laws that we have now because of the stripping of social licence. And so you're going to get more of that. The bad decisions, you're going to strip away that social licence. And we're seeing it now. You know, we're seeing a return to protests and that sort of trench warfare mentality. So it's in business's interest to have better decisions being made. And I think that goes back to the idea of having some sort of independent oversight, whether it be an EPA or a commissioner or something.
Can I push back on the point about
Sure.
social licence being stripped? I don't know if I necessarily entirely agree with you, and I say it for this reason. Mm-hmm. And the BCA was actually mentioned by both parliamentarians before. For the information of this audience, the BCA no longer represents the single biggest business organisation in the world that supports sustainable development. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development took away the remit of the BCA in May of 2014. Who did they give it? Who did they give it to? Sustainable Business Australia. So the BCA, with the deepest respect to Jennifer and the board, do not represent the constituency in this country that necessarily wants to see a more progressive, forward-thinking approach to the issues that we're talking about today. And it's fascinating that we have the challenge around the social licence to operate, which I do find the resources sector is being challenged by at the moment, very much so. And you're only seeing, I think, the first stages of that at international level, let alone a local level, particularly around the question of fossil fuel divestment. But when it comes to the question of the EPBCA, with the deepest respect, its time has come and it needs to be rethought from a far more progressive position. And the role that business has to play is to align its own policy making with its own sustainable development goals. So this notion that government has the role to play is, with the deepest respect, bunkum. If business is not at the table, and progressive business looking at how it's going to reform the prosperity created out of a more effective natural resource management for this country, then it doesn't deserve to be here in any event.
My question's about the native forest logging sector and what sort of priority each of the parties and stakeholder organisations give to that issue, given its importance to carbon capture and storage, to biodiversity, to connectivity across landscapes. The collapse of the Tasmanian Forest Agreement and the expiry of the regional forest agreements that Larissa alluded to give, to me, this a heightened importance. But what do the parties think and stakeholder groups about the importance of that very dwindling, extremely important asset?
One of the great tragedies was the smashing of the Tasmanian Forestry Agreement. It was an extraordinary achievement. And you have to spend time in Tasmania, as I'm sure a lot of people do, to understand the depth of the conflict there over decades. You know, a conflict that divided small towns, divided families. It was just awful. And I think the maturity of the parties to the agreement, which didn't represent all of each of the constituencies in the community, if you like, but sensible parts of the constituencies coming together, all giving up something to try and put the conflict behind them and move forward, I think was an extraordinary achievement, and in everyone's interest at the end of the day, particularly given the importance of certification of forests for the future, and just the blindness with which Abbott and what's his name, Tasmanian Hodgman, sort of blindly just stomping in and smashing that future, I think, is only becoming apparent to them now. So, quite what the future holds, I'm not really sure. You know, I think we've tried to let things calm a bit, let a bit of the poisonancy out of the issue down in Tasmania, but we're going to have to engage again over the next little while with what the future might look like as a potential federal government, I guess, over the next 12 to 18 months. More broadly, I agree with Larissa that the expiry of the RFAs, I think you made this point in your remarks, the expiry of the RFAs are a good opportunity for us to take stock about how they're going, and particularly the monitoring and enforcement of some of the conditions within the RFAs, the state of biodiversity within those areas, I think is something we want to have a very close look at. I think we've only just started to have a discussion with Larissa's party about what that process might look like. We've obviously got to have a discussion with some of the very interested stakeholders, you know, TWIS, the CFMEU, forestry industry, and so on and so forth. So I guess sort of watch this space. One of the things, though, I think that was one of the most disturbing elements of environmental protection policy over the last several years was the land clearing law changes in Queensland and New South Wales, particularly Queensland, because we know that the only substantial progress we made in our carbon footprint over the Kyoto period was because of land clearing, or reduction in land clearing, particularly in Queensland, where the scale, as you know, of land clearing up there in the last couple of decades was sort of Amazonian, really, in its scale. So the idea of climate change triggers, which was a policy we took to the 2007 election, for example, under Beasley and Albo, the idea of climate change triggers is usually raised in the context of mines like the Galilee, but I think also raised significant questions around land clearing, because I think the performance of the state governments, particularly in Queensland and New South Wales around land clearing, were abysmal, utterly abysmal.
I guess when it comes to forestry, it's not my portfolio. We have a very odd division of responsibility in the Greens, and I leave forestry issues to the Tasmanians. The Tasmanian Forest Agreement was quite controversial, and there were those in the Greens that held different views about its utility. I did not get involved in the detail because I don't represent Tasmania, but the parts of that agreement which did concern me were the restrictions on advocacy for conservationists and activists. I don't think it's right to silence community participation ever, and certainly not as a result of a deal that was a compromise arrangement. So, but beyond that, I don't have fixed views on whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. I confess I don't know enough about it to know whether it would have delivered good environmental outcomes or not. That said, I think the time for native forest logging is over. The rest of the world doesn't want to buy wood chips that was once old growth forest. We need to see the writing on the wall, and we've got wonderful opportunities for plantation forestry that can adequately meet our wood needs in a way that isn't taking away those wonderful carbon stores and all of the fantastic biodiversity and connectivity values that we know native forests can have.
I guess when I think of forestry and think of RFAs, I think of a salutary lesson that can be learnt from when the Commonwealth vacated the field a little bit. We've seen, decades of over a decade of agreements where states have been handed responsibility under agreements to meet the objectives of the EPBC Act and are failing. So I guess for me at BirdLife, caring about swift parrots and seeing that a matter of national environmental significance is going down the gurgler, like it's probably going to be listed as critically endangered within the next 12 months. So clearly the state government is failing to protect that matter under current agreements. So salutary lesson is what I'm thinking, and I wouldn't want to see these this rolling accreditation idea that's being proposed. I think it's very dangerous.
Andrew?
Just to add that the manufactured products sector and forestry sector were gobsmacked because, as I said before, they were already starting to prepare for the transition, and so it was taken away from them, and so business models had to be reworked overnight. And the second was that there was a lost opportunity. A new nascent business, which was the carbon offset sector, was going to be lost. So that was disappointing as well.
Yes, look, there must be some questions from this side of the room.
Can I add?
Yes.
Sue from EDO. This is not necessarily my view, but I would just point out with the business sector and the manufacturer and the actual timber industry representatives that perhaps, your kind of leading organisation needs to be aware of that, at the moment in New South Wales with the timber industry, there's there's a very, very different view. For example, we're talking about adding one new national park, which happens to be, core koala habitat, and it's been shown that it would be a significant contribution to the protection of koalas, and it's a high biodiversity area for protection of, biodiversity within the regional the comprehensive adequate representative reserve system. But it's really interesting how much rhetoric is coming out in light of what Larissa's saying. We're at the end of the native forest logging industry, perhaps. And perhaps your peak organisation can see that. But you've got, at the moment, there's a real kind of grassroots fight still happening where there's so much misinformation coming from the National Party members and the business community or the forest products community about how many jobs will be lost and, etc. There is so much out there now. And I just wonder, how do you harness that if from your perspective, how do you harness those grassroots groups that, really look to the support of your sort of peak organisations that are claiming that they're on their sort of death knell, etc., where there really is not much credibility to the real discussion?
Firstly, and I say wherever I can, business is not this monolithic entity that is one particular voice. There are a number of voices, and those voices quite often are not necessarily the same within the one entity. Can I be clear about that? Otherwise I wouldn't have a gig, can I tell you? The second is, and it's interesting you raised, that in so many aspects at the moment that the social licence to operate that was mentioned is really going through a massive shake-up, whether it is on the issue of climate change, particularly for the fossil fuel sector, whether it's for biodiversity and particularly what we call the sustainable lifestyle sector, so consumer and manufactured products sector. Globally, they are immensely challenged by the right to actually use water for the products that they are developing. That also comes with the challenge around biodiversity, and you're obviously seeing in the confectionery sector that challenge around palm oil, cocoa and now sugar. These are issues that are on the Fortune 500's top 3 issues, to take Mark's point. Environment is actually number 1 for most of the global companies at the moment. And it is because of whether it's massive fear that they will lose the licence to operate within the particular segment that they're operating in by reason of NGOs articulating a contrary argument very vocally, particularly on social media, or they have just through a process now of about 20 years, their own DNA telling them that this is not the way in which to behave if we're going to create shared prosperity. And what's challenging about that is to hear a CEO of the age of about 50 say, using the expression shared prosperity. It really freaks you out, because you thought that we're only talking about shareholder value, but we're no longer, for a large number of companies, particularly globally, talking only about shareholder value. To give you some very practical examples, in the area of biodiversity internationally, there's a major piece of work being undertaken called the Natural Capital Coalition. And that is being done by the UNGC, the IUCN, GRI, World Business Council, and a number of different funding agencies, particularly from philanthropes. But what's interesting is that there are a major number of major international companies, including Nestle, Ferrero, Mars, just trying to think of all the others, Unilever, Walmart, believe it or not, that have understood that if they are not directly impacting the issue of killing a threatened species, it's their supply chain that is. And that's been the massive transformation in sustainability over the last 10 years globally. The realisation that your business has a massive impact from an LCA or a sustainability lifestyle perspective. What we're not seeing yet in Australia is that reality come hard to most companies. But what I think we are starting to see is as they become connected into international supply chains, they are either a giver or a taker of that particular issue. So the Natural Capital Coalition was in fact set up by, believe it or not, the finance sector, who have come to the stark realisation that the loss of assets, which is natural capital, whether biodiversity or water, on land that they hold, will become worthless to them. Totally and absolutely worthless. And I speak from personal experience. The National Australia Bank, being the biggest agribusiness bank in this country, knows that if they do not identify what the risk to capital is for that particular company by identifying how they can price the risk of the loss of biodiversity and water on the assets that they hold, they are going to have a portfolio that nobody is going to invest in. So they have established this, they've signed up on the Natural Capital Declaration, and the Natural Capital Coalition is now working furiously around the world over the next 12 months to develop a systemic financial risk assessment of what the loss of biodiversity means. Now that must at some point translate into this country as to its relevance when a particular company wants to start developing on land which has a threatened species on it. It must, and it will, because we'll make sure it does.
Effectively, you get a state approval of a matter affecting an MNES if you don't pull the significance trigger, don't you? Because the only approval you'll have is at the state level.
Sure.
Okay?
So you're talking about the application of the significance
Yeah,
trigger
the
at the control
significance
action
trigger.
phase
Yes.
at that first point. Yeah.
Yes. So if you don't pull that trigger, only the state gets to assess
True,
a project
yes.
that may in fact have an impact on a matter of national environmental
But
significance,
not a significant impact.
which the minister has, for whatever reason, decided not to pull that trigger. If you remove the trigger and simply require the minister to assess any project that might impact at whatever level, you remove the discretionary trigger. But the minister then has, of course, a discretion at what level to assess.
I see what you mean.
I mean, the normal reason for having a significance trigger is you require a much higher level assessment than EIS. But it's not like that under the EPBCA, so you don't have to do that. You know, and significance was a way of trying to weed out stuff that was not significant. But surely all you need to do that is assess at a lower level if you think it's not significant, and then you've got to justify. So there'll be a completely transparent process by the federal minister about the level at which he's decided to assess this impact. But then you'll remove the discretionary nature of significance, but you'll have to justify the level of assessment given.
That's a great concept. So I guess to elaborate on that, the whole point is in order to be controlled action, you've got to be decided that you're likely to have a significant impact.
That's right.
But the irony then is that you can get your approval based on preliminary documentation, which seems to be a bit of a step backwards if you just deem something likely to have a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance. So your concept's attractive in that you're saying you've still got those tiers of assessment which would reflect the potential of the impact.
That's right. So you
without
wouldn't need the
needing that
significance
initial.
trigger.
Yeah, that's a good concept. I'll think on that further. Like I said, when we were having discussions about whether we would advocate dropping the significance threshold or broadening the scope then in the essence to be all matters of the environment but keeping significance. There's pros and cons on either side, and we're open to discussion. I think that's a great idea. The other point I want to make about significance is, of course, it's not defined in the Act, and the administrative guidelines have been subject to the Federal Court at least once that I can recall being involved in, and possibly subsequently since then. There's a great confusion about what the hell it means, and I think for the sake of the ease of use of the Act from both community members and proponents, we need to either clarify what we mean by significance in a way that's beyond challenge, or think about ditching it entirely. So good food for thought. I don't have a conclusion on that.
The precautionary principle has a trigger as well. But the Land and Environment Court's always said if you don't trigger the precautionary principle, you still trigger caution. It's axiomatic. The court says that you always, when an environmental issue is involved, you have caution. But there's no such fallback under the EPBCA, because if you don't trigger significance, the feds don't get to deal with it. They just don't look at it.
Because I just want to carry on from Jerry's excellent point there, because it's not just this issue about the significant impact. Andrew McIntosh from ANU did some really interesting work last year around the way in which the particular manner determinations are made, the way that you can avoid significant impact in the first place by showing that you're undertaking work in a particular manner. And as you know, usually you're not allowed to consider offsets or setting up of reserves or other things in that particular manner determination. But in fact, in his pretty comprehensive review of those determinations, he's found that in fact it's done quite often. So I'm really just making that as an observation, but using it as a segue into an invitation to the whole panel to comment on offsets.
Unfortunately, I think on paper they sound good, and they sound like a way to mitigate environmental damage once something has been approved. In practice, they guarantee an approval, and it means that the decision about whether to actually say no to a project is, in my view, not having been a decision maker, in my view, is never seriously considered, because they always race to offsets, even though it's meant to be, and it is written in the law, a last resort. It is so rarely a last resort. It's often a first port of call. So I think, and the concept that you can offset nature is one that I have difficulty with in the abstract. And where is the net gain? We've got one planet. If you're destroying something, how can you make up for it by protecting something that already exists anyway? So I think it's about rehabilitation. Should be rehabilitating anyway. So I'm afraid I'm a bit of a purist in regard to offsets, and just think conceptually difficult, and in practice just a fig leaf for continued approvals.
The one thing that I was going to just add in terms of, and offsets I think goes exactly to this, and this significance idea is, I think one of the biggest problems that the end result with the EPBC Act is that the ultimate finding is whether an impact is acceptable or unacceptable. And at the moment, all determinations result in, bar the four we know of, that the impacts, assuming all of these things, offsets included, and mostly offsets now, the project can go ahead and the impacts are not unacceptable. There is no external reference, there's no objective criteria, there is nothing. And I know, Larissa, you pointed on that idea of surely one fetter on what is an unacceptable impact, one fetter on discretion would have to be the extinction or the no longer viability of a species or a community on planet Earth. But we have nothing. And I just wonder whether you think there is a quick fix that could help the EPBC Act and help the decision makers to say, well, actually, this is an unacceptable impact.
I'll start with Mark.
Thanks. Well, I don't have a concluded view about offsets. I don't have a concluded view, as Larissa does, about whether, as a concept, it is sound. And I want to continue that discussion. There's been some really good work in the Senate digging into this, really digging deep into the operation of the system, and I think that's a good opportunity to have more of a first principles think about the concept. I do want to have a think about the idea of it being last resort and also how it's been operating. But you know, one of the very few advantages of being in opposition is you do then have the opportunity to spend some time thinking about the concept of something like offsets. I do though think that the point that is at the heart of your comment is something we shouldn't take lightly, and that is that you know, I think inherent in your comment is the idea that the EPBC Act should regularly see decision makers knocking back projects on the basis that there is a significant impact to a matter of national environmental significance.
No, it's an unacceptable impact. Sorry.
Well,
yeah.
Well, an unacceptable impact. I don't think there's been anywhere near the discussion that would be needed to lift the punching power of that legislation to be able to do that. You know, there just wasn't that discussion, as I understand it, in the formation of legislation in '99, and there hasn't been that discussion since. And if there is to be that discussion, that would empower the Minister to take into account economic, social and environmental impacts and say, no, there is a significant impact on a threatened species that we don't think is able to be dealt with by offsets alone, and therefore bang. Now, I'm not saying that shouldn't be the case, but I came to this portfolio with a piece of legislation that had been operating for a decade and a half, essentially on the basis that there was a bias towards approval, and if there was a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance, that was dealt with by the department and by the Minister by coming up with some offsets. That's the philosophical framework, and to use the word licence, which has been thrown around a bit, the political licence of that legislation. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that if you take the opportunities that come along with a radical right-wing government like Newman or Abbott to have a really good rethink about the first principles that underpin a piece of legislation like EPBC Act, you do have to lift the community debate. You do have to have a discussion beyond rooms like this into places you love, campaigns and such like, to say, does the Australian community want a government and a piece of legislation that will knock back project approvals, even if there is a significant economic benefit in the short term in nature of jobs, because there is an unacceptable significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance. And I don't think that is the backdrop. I don't think it's ever been the backdrop to this piece of legislation. Sorry, that was a bit philosophical, but you know, there is the narrow answer I can give to offsets, and then there is the rabbit hole that really that leads us down, which is what level of licence do we get as a government from the community, or as a parliament from the community, to make some really hard decisions about knocking back project approvals. And this legislation has never been underpinned by that level of licence, I don't think.
Larissa, very quickly, because we're almost out of time.
Yeah, just quickly, I don't think there's a quick fix to the law that can give ministers guts to refuse projects. I think the law as it is written allows ministers to refuse projects, and for political reasons they choose not to. Because there's been that absence of political will to refuse approvals, that's why I propose legislative fetters on the discretion to try and insert some guts into the system. And I'm not accusing Mark of being gutless, but you are right that there is that trend of guaranteed approvals, and I'm sure it is hard to swim against that tide, but it's got to be done, because look at the state of the planet. Pardon my almost swearing, so I'm glad I didn't do that.
It was bleeped out for the record.
So yes, I think the quick fix is political will to use the powers of the legislation to actually refuse. In the absence of that, let's feather the discretion so that there are some mandated situations in which you have to refuse, like the extinction of a species as the most obvious example. And secondly, just on offsets, I was really pleased that I got support from the Senate to establish an inquiry into offsets, and it was a references inquiry, so that's the one that's not chaired by the government and not just looking at a piece of legislation. It's a broad range of inquiry. The report into that is a really good read. It's an excellent report. And there's, I guess, two schools of thought on this. If you wanted to improve offsets, the list of recommendations in the report is actually a superb way of doing them. The Greens took the view that we think even if you made all of those approvals, we still have difficulty with the concept, and they'll still be used as a de facto leave pass to approve everything. But if you differed from that view, those list of recommendations are actually a really good way of improving the offset system. So have a read if you haven't already, but it sounds like you have. Thanks, Jan.
Samantha?
Yeah, just I guess back to you were sort of talking about the theoretical, and I think I can sort of pin to an example right now that's probably, limit of discretion, sort of a boundary thing. So, and it does bring in offsets a little bit. So I'm thinking about the black-throated finch in the Galilee. So if that goes ahead under the Act, then we will see the extinction of that subspecies. It's just, it's going to wipe out more than 60% of the habitat for the species. The other population is already in decline. It's going to happen. So if the Act can't be used to stop that, then there is no limit. So that needs to be reviewed, because it should be able to right now.
Well, it can. They just haven't used it.
Yeah. The idea that can be offset is arrogant in the extreme. We do not know enough about these species, and they have very wide ranging requirements. So to think that we can offset its habitat over a decade, when we're going to have fluxes in El Nino, La Nina cycles, drought, all these, we just don't know enough about it to say that we could, even if we tried. So that's, I guess, a little concrete example that's happening right now. But I think going back to what you were saying about how would we know whether or not, I was just thinking about we're not doing enough to look back over how the Act has operated. So the Hawke Review was looking at the administration of the Act, but not whether or not it was doing what it was set out to do, which is basically the protection of biodiversity. I mean, the compliance, the level of compliance has improved recently, but to look back over the history of the Act and the amount of compliance reviews and auditing and actually we're making decisions in the dark a lot of the time in terms of the information base that we're using on how the Act's operating. So, I don't know, we need to learn lessons from the past, I guess. So in terms of whether or not there should be, I think there should be a lot less discretion. And review of the merits of decisions as well. That's crazy not to be able to look at that.
I thank the panel for responding so enthusiastically and fulsomely. Could we please thank, in the correct order, the Honourable Mark Butler, Shadow Minister for the Environment, Senator Larissa Waters, Australian Greens, Samantha Vines, Places We Love, and Mr. Andrew Peterson. Thank you very much.